huge ass party at our house. And now we're live. So I don't know how much I want to say about my personal life. Our wedding is a destination wedding. So we just had a big ass party for everyone that can't come. So we had like over 100 people at our house, and it's not a big house, but we have a nice lawn. So it was a lot of work, but it was
cool.
It was a fun time. I came out of it with a couple injuries actually.
Really? Where are you going for the wedding?
Punta Cana.
Cool.
Dominican. Yeah.
Oh, that's in the Dominican. Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. All right.
So now to philosophy.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. All right. So hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. And I'm going to talk today to, as you already see, Hayden Bruce, my friend, also known as Pragmatic Christian, and then James Sullivan, who has James and the Giant podcast about philosophy and postmodernism. And we're going to talk about postmodernism, pragmatism, the similarities and differences between them, and how you can apply those perspectives to theology. All right, so why don't one of you guys just introduce yourselves there and say a little bit about yourself, and then we can go from there.
Okay. My name's James. I host a podcast called James and the Giant Podcast, where I talk about philosophy and literature and try and make philosophy accessible to people that don't have any kind of exposure to it. And that's all I do, aside from work a regular job.
It's a very useful thing.
Yeah, and other than my useful job, regular job, I host a podcast called the Pragmatic Christian Podcast, where I talk to different people either I know or people who I connect with, authors, philosophers, theologians, writers, different people to discuss various aspects of humanity. I'm very much interested in the variety of human experience. I'm not really interested in any one correct way at doing human life. And so I'm coming out of a background of studying philosophical pragmatism. So that kind of pluralism is kind of an inherent attitude of pragmatists, but not necessarily an inherent feature of pragmatism. But that's my own personal way of looking at things, is that pluralism. So I talk to a lot of different people, have a lot of different interesting conversations, including the ones with Andrew and the different people he brings me into contact with. So I always enjoy these chats. So thanks for having me as well.
Awesome. I'm excited to get into what perspectives you guys share and some differences, and how we can both help each other understand all of these different ideas a little bit better. So first, I was thinking, one thing that you and I have talked about before, Hayden, is about how postmodernism, it's sort of a philosophy it's about deconstructing concepts and language, and you know this all too well, James, that people get confused about that all over the place and think that it means that postmodernists want to like break down civilization or some shit like that, which is kind of ridiculous when you understand the philosophy. But
destroy the Western civilization.
Yeah, exactly. But one thing that I like about pragmatism that we've talked about before, Hayden, is that it doesn't, like postmodernism, it's not like a philosophical worldview that's prescriptive, and pragmatism is kind of more prescriptive in that it's kind of similar to Stoicism in that it's kind of centered around what are the best ways to live your life. So what do you think about that whole concept?
I'll start off by saying that pragmatism is similar to Stoicism. And a more accurate way to phrase that is that specific pragmatists are more similar to Stoicism. Like there's some scholars who link William James's writings to Stoicism, where a lot of, at least I think Aurelius now I'm going to expose my own limited knowledge on all these things, especially Stoicism. It's something that I want to study more and more, like all the time, but I just never get to.
It's really
I just listened to your latest podcast about Stoicism, actually, James.
You did? Holy shit!
Yeah, I listened to it today. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was driving for work and I ended up seeing that come up, so I was like, oh, interesting.
I'm
gonna listen
it was great. I don't have a whole lot of experience with Stoicism either, except a kind of a naive conception of what it was, and so I used a lot of that podcast to just kind of try and educate myself and ask the kinds of questions that I have about it.
Oh, okay. In terms of Stoicism, I would say, along with Postmodernism and Pragmatism, I would say Stoicism is one of the 3 main branches of philosophy that I've been studying for a few years or so. And I got to talk with a professor of philosophy who focuses mainly on Stoicism, William Ferriolo, a few times on my podcast, and that was really interesting. He wrote a book recently called Meditations on Self-Discipline and Failure, which is a good book about Stoicism. And I'm sure both of you guys are aware of who people regard as the kind of the seminal Stoics.
There were Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Zeno. It has a lot of gaps in its tradition, which I think is really weird. There's like 1,000-year gaps in between Stoicism reemerging.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Stoicism, it wasn't the dominant school in ancient Greece, and so when Rome fell apart, the Stoics weren't as preserved as Plato and Aristotle's work. They didn't get any love from the Catholic Church, and it was during the Renaissance that some of their texts were resurfaced.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Cool.
Yeah, the way that Greg Sadler said it, a bunch of monks found some scrolls and started reading them.
Oh, that's cool.
There is a little bit of a connection between especially Seneca, I believe, and the Christians of that time. I know that there were some letters that were supposedly between the Apostle Paul and Seneca that are obviously fakes, but have circulated at one time or another, acting as if they really were. So there were small periods where there was a stronger connection. But yeah, certainly not widespread. And it was probably mostly based on the fact that Stoicism was kind of connected to, from my understanding, connected to the metaphysics of like Plato and Aristotle, which the Catholic Church took on completely. So
yeah, I think
shit.
And depending on the perspective you have too, you could say that in a sense Stoicism it does have a metaphysical aspect, but it's interesting that Diogenes the Cynic was one of the main influences on, I believe it was Zeno, who was one of the first Stoics. And Diogenes was a really fascinating guy because he was all about basically breaking down metaphysical views and like cultural values and stuff like that. Like he's said to have done things like shit in the street and masturbate in front of people, and he would live in a wine barrel. And then
Diogenes is my fucking man. I love that. Yeah. Diogenes taught Kratos or Cretes, and that's who taught Zeno. Dr. Sadler told that story on the podcast too. It was really interesting.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to get into the history of how these schools of thought all started and how they influenced each other.
You can also get a better idea of how philosophies get underdeveloped because they weren't popular enough, or that school just died out for whatever reason. War.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I'm not.
We don't have anything of hardly any texts about the Presocratic philosophers, the ones that came before Socrates, and those are the guys that are really interesting.
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. I should really study those some more.
They're really great, but we only have fragments, and then we have texts referring to texts, which are increasingly unreliable.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
yeah. To go back to the original question that you asked me, I do want to just clarify one thing about pragmatism and Stoicism, specifically pragmatism, is that it's not so much prescriptive as much as it is methodological. It kind of provides a way of looking at things rather than prescribing ways or prescribing specific things to, accept and believe. A lot of people have challenged the idea that it even is a philosophy, because, very much like postmodernism, which is where my interest connecting pragmatism and postmodernism comes from, is in the fact that like every single one of the pragmatists disagreed very much on very core philosophical ideas. They all had different ways of looking at like the realism, anti-realism debate, of looking at the use or correspondence of truth and all sorts of different things. So it really is a tradition of attitudes, a tradition of ways of looking at certain philosophical topics, which is one of the big reasons why I was, I would say, interested in like postmodernism. I kind of became a postmodernist when I was more in my like fundamental Christian like phases. That was kind of my first step into the deep water. And then as I kind of went through my own like faith crisis and everything kind of fell away, like I kind of I needed some kind of foundation. So I kind of moved away from postmodernism. And then I found pragmatism, and then I started to make these connections.
Solid foundation.
Not really.
Very actionable.
Yeah, but there aren't any foundations. That's kind of the thing. It's just kind of like you kind of somehow you have to find out a way to stop caring about specific answers and be a lot more interested in the way you ask questions. And so I was able to make that leap, but not other people are, which is another reason why I'm interested in like the variety of people and personalities, because not everyone's going to look at things the same.
Yeah, that's a really important point. That's why it's really important to not read just one philosopher or even just one book about one particular realm of philosophy. To really get a good understanding of it, you have to read a variety of different authors, since they look at it from different perspectives. And I would say that's okay. I would say that's fairly true of at least most realms of philosophy, but maybe some more than others, maybe pragmatism more than postmodernism, for instance. But yeah, like I mainly read those pragmatist philosophers in the books that you've recommended to me, Hayden, like William James and John Dewey and Sammy Philstrom. And it is interesting to compare different philosophers too, just like how in Stoicism, it's interesting to compare like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and Epictetus, for example. Like Epictetus is on the Art of Living. That's probably my favorite Stoic text, because it's probably the most straight up prescriptive one of all of them, which is interesting, because one of the reasons that I like postmodernism so much is that it's almost the opposite of prescriptive. It's like breaking down values and power structures and deconstructing language and looking at ideas through a historical perspective. And that's interesting that you mentioned that you were more of a postmodernist when you were fundamentalist Christian, though, Hayden.
Oh, yeah.
That's actually something that I wanted to talk to both of you guys about, like like you, James, for example, because I know you have a more of an interest in postmodernists, and you've read many more of the postmodernist texts than I have. I kind of want to know what both of you guys think about in terms of relating postmodernism to Christianity, and then also how that compares to your pragmatist perspective on it, Hayden. So
yeah, I don't know who you want to start with that.
yeah, maybe
I'll-
James, because we haven't heard from you in a while.
Yeah, I'll take the lead on that. So the series that I just did with Tim Keefe, he dumped a whole lot of philosophy on me that I hadn't been exposed to at all. And what we covered yesterday was this sociologist named Zygmunt Bauman. And I say sociologist, not philosopher, because he did sociology. Foucault did archaeology. He did history. Derrida did mostly literature. But when you do anything on a super high level, it ends up looking a lot like philosophy. I want to try and correct the language that we use when we talk about what postmodernism does or what it's seeking to do, because I don't think it would be accurate to say that postmodernism is involved or motivated to deconstruct anything. What it's trying to do is,
I mean, like rhetorical deconstruction. Would that be inaccurate?
We're just trying to look at the world and see how it's organized and see how it's always been organized, and how that organization is from the modern project, the project of modernity, that it's kind of been fucked up. And I didn't think about this until these last couple episodes that I did. But a lot of the postmodern condition also applies to our economic status. And so the current state of late stage capitalism is fundamentally postmodern. And most of the people that I see criticizing postmodernism kind of like capitalism. So I wonder if they could include a economic critique in whatever they want to do when they talk about postmodernism.
That's interesting. What so how do people who are involved in our late stage of capitalism, how is their perspective heavily postmodern?
So I no longer I try and think of, and this is something I've been trying to describe, postmodern as not a philosophy, but right now it's more like a time period.
Right.
And the reason that, so there was a big boom of books being written in the late 80s and early 90s about postmodernism. It's when Leotard came out with his book, and the moniker just kind of stuck, postmodern. But most people have abandoned that now, and now we say like postmodern, and it's gotten redundant and ridiculous because we're still in modernity. We're not outside of modernity anymore. We're not post. It's still very much with us and a part of us. We're just in a different configuration of attitudes and status. Yeah.
Okay.
What was your question?
My question was how is this late stage of capitalism heavily postmodern?
So a lot of it has to do with deregulation. So when we think about deregulation in contrast to the project of like the Hegelian model, where you have the purpose, it's a trajectory, it's a conclusion that will be reached. But so say you make, here's a good example, you guys will resonate with this. If you collect all 151 Pokemon cards, you will be a Pokemon master.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, obviously.
That's the modern structure. There is a goal, you can reach it. But what did late stage capitalism do? Late stage capitalism showed that
push the goal.
We will continue to consume as long as there is continued production. So now you can't be a fucking Pokemon master because there's 700 Pokemon and you can't buy that many decks.
We want
So you don't
everyone
get to be a
be
Pokemon master.
Pokemon master.
That's
And our
depressing.
lives are, it can be. And that's, I think people that get an introduction into postmodernism and say, this sucks, it looks like nihilism, because they want to avoid nihilism. Even if it's, sometimes I think nihilism can be a rational perspective.
Yeah, that's a good
it's
point.
not favorable because sometimes it's really depressing.
Mhm.
Other times it can be really cool, like Camus was pretty cool.
Yeah,
Who knew what was going
that's
on.
a good point.
But it has to do with your attitudes and adaptability. So, but it doesn't have to be nihilistic.
Yeah, I think people make that error a lot, where they assume that. I was talking with someone about this the other day. The idea of criticizing meta narratives is, I would say, an essential part of what Derrida and particularly Foucault talk about. And it's weird. It's weird to me, like, now that I've talked to people like you, James, and learned from people like Thaddeus Russell too, and read books by Foucault and Derrida, that it seems weird to me, once you understand what those philosophers are trying to say, that criticizing meta-narratives is like a large part of what they do. So saying that if you don't have a meta-narrative, you're going to just descend into nihilism or something like that, that's just a huge slippery slope argument.
But that's the conclusion of the modern framework. So you think about the hero's journey. That's a really popular thing. The hero only has one destination, one goal, the telos, the purpose. Once he achieves that, and if the hero fails, then the story is ruined. So they view anything outside of that course, that trajectory, as ultimately leading you into ruin.
Yeah, which is a extremely biased way of looking at how the varieties of different ways in which you can live, like you were talking about earlier, Hayden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so I'm very much a student of postmodernism right now. Obviously not as much as like pragmatism, because that's really my main interest, but I really am just a receiver of information at this point. Like, I don't have that many critiques of postmodernism, only critiques of specific philosophical debates, like relativism. Relativism isn't
fine.
postmodernism, but relativism is an idea that you can critique. So that's all I have. I very much want to learn a lot more about postmodernism. And so my question, because I listened to your interviews with, was it Tim Keefe?
Tim Keefe. Yeah.
Tim? Okay.
Those are great.
And yeah, it was mind expanding, especially,
this next one,
well,
I'm telling you guys, this next one is the one that I think really does it.
That's going to give me
excited.
multiple mindgasms.
But my question about this different understanding or paradigm for understanding like what postmodernism is it? So my question is, under this understanding, I just had it really well formulated in my head. Is it an eye-opening understanding how things actually are under modernism that they're trying to blow up, or is it this is how things have always been, that modernism is missing? That's what I'm trying to understand, because it's obviously not here's postmodernism, you believe this and now you're acting like a postmodernist. It's a way of looking at history. It's a way of looking at reality and history, specifically from our situation. Is that correct, or am I
would say that an emergent trend in postmodernity, not postmodernism, just the time period that we will call postmodern. So say, I think it starts in the 1900s, but let's say 1970s till today.
Mm-hmm.
There's a trend of thought that says if you can look at your conclusion to whatever your argument is, your conclusion or your belief, and we can trace a history very clearly where did this belief come from, how was this belief established, what other ideas were around that we don't hear about. And so now there's a criticism of philosophy today is that philosophy is just a mixture of people doing historical studies, historical research, which is important, and then language games on the other end. Mm-hmm. I like both of those things, so that doesn't bother me. But I wouldn't say that postmodernity has any kind of established ethic. I'm still learning about new ethical
implications,
ethical principles, and things like that. Different schools of thought. I just learned about. I understood this argument immediately, but I hadn't heard it as expressivism, which is the argument that a person's moral standing, so wherever they stand on an ethical issue, says more about their attitudes towards that thing than it does about some external truth about right and wrong.
Oh, right. That makes total sense.
So rather than there being an objective good that you feel, it's really your feelings of goodness or your feelings of the good.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me.
And that comes from Hobbes, who I hate. But there you go. So,
so my next question, which is kind of a reformulation of the first question, is because I'm really trying to understand. So is postmodernism or postmodernity as a category of understanding whatever, we're trying to figure that out, or I'm trying to figure that out. So it sounds like to me, it's not something that is taught and now I understand and believe in postmodernism. It's more like everyone, whether you're a capitalist, modernist, whatever you want to identify with, Republican, Democrat, we are all in postmodernity.
Every single one of us is postmodern. Got it.
Okay.
So think of it, that part of the struggle that we have and the people that were trying to write books about this shit in the 90s is that you're still stuck in it. You can't go back in time and ask Aristotle to write about ancient philosophy. And just be like, what, you mean my friends over there? He didn't understand. We're in a time period and we haven't escaped it yet. And so we can't do that nice historical bracket that we usually do, where we say, here's the Renaissance and here's everything that they thought during the Renaissance. We can kind of pull and democratize all the information and say, okay, most people believe this during the Renaissance, so we'll say that that's indicative of the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. We don't have that yet. Most people don't agree with what they think postmodernism is, so I can't imagine that it's a dominant philosophy anywhere. It's just a lot of the people that wrote about postmodernity were just examining the world that they're living in, and the best critiques were all from Marxists. Frederick Jameson is ruthless, but and he's right. But they're coming from that's their materialist perspective. They see everything through those socio and economic means. But that's not everything that's included. Because that's not everything that's going on in the world. We got all kinds of shit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important to understand that bit about Marxism too, because like when people say that postmodernists are like Marxists, it's just kind of ridiculous, because like
I know a lot of Marxists.
Yeah.
And none of them say they're postmodern.
Well, like postmodernism to me, it seems inherently anti-authoritarian and anti-absolutist, and Marxism seems much more authoritarian and absolutist to me. And in terms of what you were saying about there too, about culture and like how we're in a period of time and we're still stuck in modernism. That also reminded me of when one of your episodes with Tim Keefe, where he was talking about how a good way to understand postmodernism is kind of sociology, because a lot of the time it seems like they're commenting on how culture is changing or how culture has changed around in terms of like cultural values and ideas and language, and how the understanding of language changes.
See, it seems more to me like the theory of history or theoretical history. You know, like
history of philosophy.
Right.
It's very much what it is. A lot
like
of people that's the work they do, and it is important work because we're able. An important thing that I will suggest is indicative of postmodernity is understanding context. So history absolutely helps that, because history is a process that's never finished because we can't get the whole story. And B, it provides the context for where this information came from. Learning about Zeno getting off his boat and then looking around for a guy that could teach him philosophy because he just fucked up his job gives me a better understanding of Stoicism as a way of life.
Yeah, pragmatism is very similar in that respect, where like let's just take the big pragmatic theory of truth as an example, which is probably ill-advised to start there, but what William James is doing with that so-called quote-unquote theory of truth, it's not really a description. It's more like what he's doing with his pragmatism is doing a genealogy of truth, a genealogy of certain concepts, where you're looking at the history, you're looking at the use, like where did this idea come from? How do we actually use it? And different things like that. I feel like with postmodernism, I think it would clear up so much confusion if people, especially the people who, I don't know whether they would call themselves a postmodernist. I mean, I don't even know how exactly to like talk about this yet, but I feel like it would be helpful to distinguish postmodernity and postmodernism, because I feel like at this point, at least, even if it's not what it was originally intended, there are people who call themselves postmodernists and come with like a bag of tenets, even if that's not what postmodernity is. I feel like people that a lot of people
but they just come with, that's their own bag of tenets that they already had.
But then they're representing what postmodernity is, and they're muddying that whole discussion.
Yeah, those are both really interesting points that you brought up there. I think that it made me realize, I think I still sometimes have trouble realizing that William James, for example, is offering like a genealogy of truth, because I think that makes me think that I think I might sometimes maybe one of my disagreements with William James is that maybe I'm viewing it from too much of a modernist perspective. So maybe that would help me understand a little bit more what he's saying and maybe just pragmatism in general for pragmatist books that I'll read in the future, like those two ones that you sent to me recently. I think just one of them was a book about the history of postmodernism, and another one was about philosophy in general. And I think in terms of what you were saying about people who call themselves postmodernists, it seems to me and I want to get your thoughts on this too, James, that a lot of people, like people who are heavily talked about in the media, like people at universities who have this, like they're trying to change rules in university to fit their ideological perspectives, and people are labeling them as postmodern. Even if some of those people, to me, label themselves as postmodern, it seems like many of the things that they're doing are inherently against some of the major ideas in postmodernism.
I don't think you can be heavily prescriptive and also postmodern.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're going to try and co-opt postmodernism as an ideology, which I think you shouldn't do.
That's a really great point.
Sure, people do it. I don't have a whole lot of useful things to say about epistemology or truth. It's just that's not something I'm super concerned with. Sort of like the problem with free will. I don't have anything useful to say about it. That's not in my that's not in the realm of things that I delve into. It's important, granted. It's important. But it's like math to me. I know it's important, but I don't.
Oh, okay.
But when one of the things I liked about this series that we did on postmodernism is it encompasses very little philosophy. It's a lot of sociology. There's a lot of the positive psychology movement. Art. It started in art and architecture. And so reading like Baudrillard, who did talk about objects and their placement in your home. That doesn't have anything to do with some kind of holy noble truth that we're deconstructing. Derrida mostly just looked at literature and said, what else can I do here? How can I play with these words? Lots of people hated Derrida. It's not uncommon. You don't get credit. Nobody gets credit anymore. But it's just when I'm confronted with people that talk about postmodernism, that ism, the ISM on the end of it is really tricky because immediately I don't know what you mean when you say that.
Right.
Sometimes I do. Yeah, sometimes I do. So just don't. I either will just nod and say okay, or I'll just ignore it. There's nothing I can do with it. It would be as useless as saying I'm a human. And we go, oh, cool. From what time period? And you go, oh, 1700s. Like, wow. Tell me everything about your people. I'm like, what the fuck do you mean? Like, Descartes had different ideas about the Enlightenment and its projects than David Hume, but we consider them together. Right. Maybe in 200 years, we're gonna slap Jordan Peterson and Zizek together in the same group of just disputing academics. That's all it is. It's just academics arguing with each other.
Yeah, that's really
that's why when you actually start to study like philosophy, I mean, at least what has definitely developed for me is that I mean, when I'm talking to people that don't know anything about philosophy, obviously you use these big terms: pragmatism, postmodernism, modernism, these different terms. But when you are actually thinking about, or for me, when I'm actually thinking about philosophy, like I'm thinking about Jamesian pragmatism. I'm thinking about Derridian, just Derridian philosophy. I don't even know. You start using people's names.
I try and narrow my focus because it's helpful.
Yeah. Because there's characteristics of like a movement or a group of people, but like that's it. Like even with the pragmatists, like there really isn't a pragmatist manifesto. Like there almost could not ever be. And I feel like the same is true with postmodernism, and that would be one of the connections between the two.
Right. The only people that have written what the postmodern manifesto is are people who were only interested in arguing about postmodern.
I think that's important to remind myself of constantly too, because I think you find that as soon as you start reading widely in any branch of philosophy, like I noticed that in Stoicism, and then I started to notice that in postmodernism, and then like I was just saying earlier, I just realized that just now about pragmatism too.
Yeah.
Oh shit.
Are you running out of time?
No, I'm getting a phone call, and my Apple
I got
products
one.
are all connected.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Do you guys see me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can still see you.
Yeah.
I don't see you.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Okay, I'm back.
See you and
All right,
hear you.
cool.
Okay. I was thinking, I wanted to go back a little bit to what you were saying earlier, Hayden, about minor influence that Stoics might have had on early Christians, because I don't really know anything about that. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, my knowledge of that is really limited. I just when I started to look in, where did it start? I honestly don't remember anymore. But I remember stumbling across like the letter between Seneca and Paul, and I was like, wait, is this true? Because like this would be immortalized if it was. And like I started like looking into it, and it was like dated. I mean, someone can fact check this, but it was dated like hundreds of years after, both of them were alive.
Yeah.
So it couldn't possibly be true, but it
Well,
was.
the guy could just not be good at dating things.
Well, yeah,
We didn't have. I couldn't just check my computer and find out what day it was.
Yeah, like dinosaur bones.
Yeah.
They were 6,000 years ago. I just guessed.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was definitely Christian groups that were circulating like Stoic like philosophy. I think Seneca specifically. And again, like it's because behind a lot of the Stoics is this Platonic and Aristotle's philosophy, which became very much attached, like completely to especially Catholic philosophy and early Christian metaphysics and theology.
The virtues all align with what Christ was about, so that makes sense too. Christ,
right? And that's how they would interpret it.
Yeah.
So I don't know how big of a movement that was, but yeah, there was definitely something there. But other than that, I haven't done too much study.
Okay. So
Christian history is wild. There's all kinds of shit that happened in there.
Yeah.
Yep. That's why I love it.
It's really crazy.
Yeah.
That was one of the best. So I went to a Bible college, which just means that I went to college to eventually become like a minister, an actual practitioner of, of ministry. I actually wanted to be a missionary, a global missionary. And so I had all these classes where you had to get your prerequisites. So we had normal classes like English and, biology and different things like that. But then on top of that, we had biblical studies, hermeneutics, which was the toughest class because the guy that led it is one of the smartest people I've ever met. Big influence on me, which I probably shouldn't say publicly because I feel like a lot of people wouldn't like that now after turning out where I've gone.
What is hermeneutics?
Hermeneutics is so when I came to it, it's basically just the study or field of interpretation, how we interpret text, how we interpret things. So a lot of postmodernists were doing hermeneutics,
okay,
or would consider themselves, as people doing hermeneutics. It really is like the study of just interpretation. And so there's different kinds of hermeneutics. You would interpret. There's some people that interpret things personally, where all interpretation is up for grabs. And then there's people from another school of hermeneutics that say, no, the authorial intent. So the author's intent is the one, standard
Author's
for the meaning. God is dead,
Yeah.
and we have killed him. So yeah, that's all that hermeneutics is. So when I'm coming into it, it is in regards to like, the Bible. How do we interpret the Bible? And so I was very much schooled in like authorial intent. So trying to narrow that down, which is always going to be necessarily an impossibility to absolutely get there. So you look at context, historical context, social context, like all the time, all these different things to kind of narrow down the message. I mean, you have the written word, which of course is interpreted by translators, but you have the written word, and then on top of that, you have all this other context to kind of so in I don't know how to necessarily describe it, whether it's in hermeneutical schools or philosophical schools, but I can't remember all the names or the chronology of the different people that came up with the different theories for hermeneutics. But I think one of the original ideas was the hermeneutical circle. So you're just circling around an idea. And so what I was taught was the hermeneutical spiral. So you're actually spiraling towards the center. So so that's hermeneutics. So which is definitely a large topic of conversation in postmodern debates or topics of discussion.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the things that got me back into Christianity was my wife. But I had to find a way to make Christianity make sense to me, and because the interpretation that I'd been taught didn't, which is what turned me away. And so I found this little enclave of leftist Twitter folks that were all hosted Christian Marxist podcasts and stuff.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah,
I didn't even know.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It's bigger than I thought. It's getting bigger. And then it mixes in with ex-evangelicals. A lot of people come away from evangelicalism hard.
Yeah, with a vengeance.
Yeah, very, very mean about it. Definitely.
Yeah. I wasn't even fundamentalist at all, but I came back with a vengeance from when I used to be Christian and then eventually became a militant atheist for several years.
Well, and you're mad. You feel like you've been lied to of a transcendental truth.
Yeah.
Like, it's one thing if you lie about Santa. Santa's not real. Okay, I can totally get around that. But Santa was just the guy that brought me presents. That's something that my parents could do. So it makes sense that Santa would not be real. But all the things you told me that God does, and now you're saying that there's nothing else that could do them, and those things don't make sense. So who's doing them at all? Like,
exactly.
My parents couldn't have made the whole world.
Right.
So
yeah, Santa is dead is a lot different than God is dead. The implications.
Nietzsche wrote Santa is dead.
Yes.
But I think that, and I thought this when I was a just regular atheist, and then I very quickly balanced back into agnosticism. But the saints, because I was studying philosophy around this time. So we look at the saints like St. Augustine and St. Aquinas. And if you read their journals, you see that they were still riddled with doubt, which is what gives their faith a frame of reference. We're taught now, because of the evangelical movement, and also because of modernity, that there is a single, unalterable, non-interpretive truth that is the literal word of the Bible, and that's what you should follow. And it disregards all hermeneutics, which people have been doing since we started writing the damn thing. And when that becomes the dominant ideology of that religion, then you're going to have a bunch of people turn away with a vengeance. And so what I've seen lately in the last like 10 years or so is this reemergence into a kinder Christianity that's a little more easy to digest. I think that's important.
And one thing in relation to that we've talked about before, Hayden, that I like about pragmatism is particularly when you talk about how William James has this this mindset of pluralism, like moral pluralism too. And I think that's a much easier way to try to understand each other's context for why they come to different perspectives, and kind of be more open-minded about understanding where someone comes from, and that can be a much easier way to have a more developed understanding of a particular philosophy or your own personal worldview.
Yeah, the pragmatic pluralism, which is coming again. So you have like the attitude of pluralism, which is something that a lot of pragmatists have, but then pluralism, capital R, is really coming from William James. And that's coming from his metaphysics that he constructed, which is actually a very original thing that he actually did, come up with. Is his metaphysics? His metaphysics was pluralist, plus his idea of radical empiricism. But just to focus on the pluralism, he believed that different ideas could be true in different ways, and so him applying that, he applied it a lot to religion, and basically the idea being that he was very much against monism, against a universalism, saying that we are all one. So he would be completely against certain
Spinoza.
mystic. Yeah, he would be against Spinoza. He would be against mystics who say we're all actually of the same substance. We're all actually the same
mysticism.
thing.
Yeah.
But he actually, in his his radical empiricism, he kind of predated neutral monism, which is that all there is the block universe that gets divided up in different ways. So it is a little bit more complicated, but he was a pluralist, saying that there are different realities that are separate, that are not the same thing, but regardless relate. So like his metaphysics has been compared, by the actual guy, but compared to process philosophy and Alfred North Whitehead and his kind of relationalism, how everything is interrelated. Whitehead was actually influenced by James in a lot of ways. He called James the Einstein of philosophy. I think it's because, thinking specifically of what Einstein did with his theory of relativity, Whitehead actually was trying to beat him to that theory of relativity and the work that he did in mathematics. And Einstein ended up winning out in that public battle. But he was referring to Einstein in regards to William James, talking about this pluralism, but relationality, where, there are particulars. William James was concerned with particulars. He wasn't concerned with generalities and, and all these big universals. He hated universals. He was very much against absolutizing anything, because he looked at that kind of overgeneralizing, absolutizing as the root of he would probably say the root of all evil, all wars, all authoritarians, all, like that kind of absolutizing will always lead to violence somewhere down the line. I think is fair to say that he thought something very close to that. And so he was very much a particularist. He liked particular things, particular people, individuals. He gave enough rope to say that we are all related. Another pragmatist developed that more after his death. He died kind of early in his life. I think it was 68. No, I think it was 50.
Sick, right?
Yeah, he always had health issues since the time he was a kid. They always do, which is why they're brilliant. But yeah, he died of like heart disease or something like that. But his pragmatism in a really real way, which is something that I was going to say actually in the beginning of the podcast, and the topic changed. His philosophy was extremely personal to him, and that's something that I was going to say at the beginning of this conversation, is that I believe that philosophy is a personal thing. I don't think that it's something to proselytize. I think it's something that's like the only way to genuinely follow any kind of philosophical system or idea or belief is to do it from a personal stance. I don't think you can proselytize certain things. The only reason why I call my show Pragmatic Christian and talk about pragmatism is because I think it doesn't get enough airtime. It's easier. It's just easier to do. You got to brand somehow. But like, I just
that's actually what we would consider a postmodern position. And so we can
see, look, I'm a postmodernist again.
One of the things that Zygmunt Bauman talks about is one of the so when we examine the conditions of postmodernity, what are our lives like now? Not because some fucking French guys that nobody read told us about it. They didn't make it true. This is what was going on, and they wrote about it. Lyotard wrote his book, which got the whole postmodern moniker off, for the government. It was government contract. He wrote it for them.
Oh, wow.
As like a sociological treatise. Where's it going with this? Oh, so Bauman talks about how one of the projects of modernization of modernity was individualization. And so we think about the Ford plants, Fordist production, where every action is set up in an assembly line. It's all individuated so that you don't have to do anything. You don't have to do anything complex, and we can very easily replace the pieces that are broken or don't work anymore. Everything is individual. It comes together in its own way. And we part of this modernization is individualizing this further and further, and that includes how we approach philosophies. It would be really weird to find two people that had the exact same philosophy. That's why these schools of thought that agree with each other are still arguing with one another.
Okay. Yeah, what you just made me think about the concept of individualism, and I wonder what both of you guys think of that in relation to, Hayden, your perspective of pragmatism and Christianity, and the idea of your concept of individualism within that, and how that compares to postmodernism. And then for you, James, the concept of individualism and in terms of Christianity, and how you justify that from a postmodern perspective.
Yeah, I think of individualism. See, that's where context comes in, to complicate the day, to complicate the situation. Because, individualism in what way? Individualism in what context, or in what,
I mean, like in terms of the message of Christ, and like what Jordan Peterson talks about often.
Right. Yeah, I would.
Death of the individual.
Yeah, I would probably say I agree a lot with Jordan Peterson's understanding of the individual, in the sense that I think that when it comes to human value and our understanding of human value, I think it has to come down to the individual. I think that pragmatically, I think that believing that each human being has a infinite worth in and of himself is a very useful society stabilizing idea. It's what keeps. I don't want to generalize too much, but as long as you guys understand that everything I say is can be caveated, but I do believe in the individual, and I very much am Jamesian in the sense that he was very individualist, but I'm also a relationalist. I won't ever, much like James, I won't say that there's a group of entities that are connected in one, and then, we're all just individual by looks or appearances only. I think that separating things out, see, I'm jumbling different ideas.
You're saying that
I just want to say
they're related. They're related.
They're related. I think
before that, you don't need to proselytize too. That sounds similar to what you were saying about that.
Yeah, we don't have to proselytize, but my understanding of human beings is that we have to understand ourselves as individuals, but descriptively. So my understanding of humanity and the human being is that we are social animals. We cannot be any other way. We will die. We will suffer if we consider ourselves isolated from other people. It's just not good for us. It's not natural in any way. And normatively, we should not be individual or isolated in that sense. But I think that our conscious, I think that our way of self-expression, I think we just naturally think of ourselves in the context of a story. I think we think of ourselves and our self-identity with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we're always somewhere in that journey, even if there isn't a specific telos that we are aiming at, in any kind of, platonic way. I think that is how we understand ourselves. So even if we just want to call that a biological factor of the human being, the fact that we're storied people, we're storied human beings or animals, then okay, we can just say that that's just descriptively we're story animals and we understand ourselves in that way, and go from there. We don't have to say that there is an ideal end or telos for every single person and separate each other, and we're all on our own specific journeys, but that's how we understand ourselves, at least in the West. I think that there's certainly different ways of understanding yourself and your identity in different cultures. But this is the one that you and I got. This is the one that the three of us have. And we can't really escape that. I don't think it's really a possibility. I can't really even imagine or conceive of how someone would change their self anthropology or self-understanding of what a human being is and their identity is. I can't understand how someone would do that within a lifetime. So I think that the individual is here to stay with us. And I think that if it's going to change at all, it's going to change very gradually over time or through some kind of catastrophe. But I don't think of it as a bug. I think of it as something that is extremely useful for, I'm trying to talk about it in very in very complex ways, and it gets fuzzy when you start to So you're saying in my mind, I'm drawing in all these different fields. But
you're saying that it's important, but it's not the whole picture, and it's not the only way that everyone needs to understand it, right?
Right. Thinking about my own philosophical anthropology, that's a very new philosophical term for me, so I keep using it. But just thinking about our own social brains as human beings, which I can actually draw on another pragmatist, who is one of the founders, if not the founder of I think sociology, which is something that's been recently notified or acknowledged. But George Mead was a pragmatist. He was a pragmatist he was influenced by the pragmatists, and by that, he's considered a pragmatist. But he was interested in psychology and sociology and the human animal and how we think and all the rest of it. But he came up with this this theory drawn from the pragmatists, about self-identity and specifically the self. You cannot have a self without other selves. So without a group, without society, without our social connections, you do not develop as an individual. You do not individuate. You need people. You need other people to mimic, to mock, to sponge up. And as you grow older, you divide those things and you become a person. You become an adult. You become, a self, someone with subjectivity. And so, all that's just to say that we are individuals who must relate to each other descriptively, saying that it's a must. It is absolutely needed in order for us to be, healthy human beings that we are.
Yeah. How, in terms of how there are multiple factors that lead to who we are and what we think, basically, right? You have to take a multidisciplinary approach to understanding human behavior, like Robert Sapolsky does in his newest book, Behave. And I think the way that Jonathan Haidt talks about it, how people are, he basically is talking about the idea of how people are social animals, like you were talking about, Bruce, is that he says that we're groupish. So we're drawn to seeking groups. And like you were saying, the collective is necessary for helping us to exist as human beings in the best possible way. But it doesn't mean that we're not absolutely necessary within the collective. Yeah,
even exactly. our consciousness, we develop the consciousness we have because of the group that we're in. It's we would not have the consciousness that all three of us would have if it wasn't for the family we grew up in the communities that we grew up in the states or in the provinces or whatever. Like, we wouldn't have the conscious we have without all those things. Like, all these social factors are all loaded with meaning and, code for our consciousness. There are no silos, there's no healthy silo of a human being. The way that we understand it today. I know I'm adding a bunch of norms and a bunch of values and stuff, but I'm comfortable with those.
Yeah.
So there's two people that talk about this. Andrew, you read Foucault's The Individual and the Subject. I think that was the title of it, right?
No, I don't think I read that one.
That was the one that you emailed me about originally. It was like subjectivity and the individual. I can't remember the exact title.
Was it that essay that you sent me?
You sent it. You found it. I didn't send it to you. Anyway.
Oh, I didn't even remember that.
Foucault talks about how the way that we understand the individual is in relation to what sets us apart from everything else. So it's still a relational practice. There's no individual individuating itself.
Mm-hmm.
Bauman talks about it, and I'm glad this came up because it's fresh on my mind. See if any of this sounds. Hayden, how old are you? 30s?
25.
Mid? Oh my God.
I know.
Andrew, how old are you?
29.
Okay. You've probably gone through this. All right. So Bauman talks about how one of the processes of individualization is a kind of deregulation of the collectivity. So you're no longer, I don't feel any sense of community with my apartment building or any of my tenants. I don't have that like you would in a village.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even have villages anymore.
Yeah.
So there's no community for me to pin my identity into, because we've deterritorialized it. I think that's a Deleuze point. He talks about deterritorialization. This was a function of modernism, modernity, and capitalism. And so the project that we have now is that the self and the individual is always reconstituting itself. So, Hayden, you wanted to be a minister. That was your hero's journey. That was your trajectory.
Yeah.
And now that that's done, you're not dead. You didn't have to commit suicide because you failed your life's journey, your destiny.
Mm-hmm.
You just reconstituted a new path,
right,
and said, "Oh, this will work just fine."
Well, the jury's out on
that. It's the only thing you have to do.
Yeah.
It's mandatory that we recon. I was a writer. I was a philosopher. What else did I think I was? I thought I was all kinds of things in my early 20s.
Yeah, for me, I thought I was going to be a personal trainer, and then I thought I was going to be a journalist, and at one point I thought I was going to be a power lifter. So yeah.
Like, do any of you have a friend that thinks he's going to be a rock star?
And that was me.
Well, actually, maybe my brother to an extent. I don't think that's necessarily his goal, but he is a musician.
I had a friend in high school that was his only aim, and that's not very aspirational when you're in high school, and also not in a band, by the way. He just played in his room. He was really good, but didn't have a band. That's step one, man.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I did. I had two bands, but that was definitely me, where I'm like, it's this or bust. If I don't become, if I don't somehow live off of music, like I mean, if I'm not making music or money making music, I will live in a van, still making music, as long as I'm putting music out there. Like, that was my journey before ministry. So I definitely can understand that.
and see, these are depths that the individual has to go through all the time. And the only thing, the reason I don't buy into individualism is because, one, I think it's the kind of configuration of individualism that Peterson talks about is a result of postmodern economic conditions. And I just can't get through that contradiction. But even outside of that, the only thing through these deaths that the individual has to experience in order to reconstitute itself, the only thing that's keeping it afloat is the relations with the others. And so that's the only way that you can individuate yourself in the first place. And it's the only way that you can get back on your feet after that individual has to die or experience just anything outside of its realm of control. Because you're not in control just because you're an individual. That's the dream, right? Full autonomy, individual autonomy. But it falls apart at every level because you're not in control of anything unless you're living by yourself alone on an island.
Like the Unabomber.
Yeah.
See, I still believe in the individual, and I completely agree with everything you just said.
I think that prioritizing them ethically, with ethical considerations in mind, that's a must.
So a hierarchy?
No. But I think when we talk about I mix up my schools of ethics here. I've got like 3 in my head that work, but not together. And I think most of my hesitation, which is also what I think a lot of people lean in on with individualism, is the paranoia that if I submit any kind of autonomy, that I absolutely won't get it back, because that's my experience every time. And so I don't want to submit any kind of autonomy. So I try and prioritize the individual. But if I want to get anything done, I'm going to have to look collectively. Almost always.
So in terms of Christianity, then, James, do you view that from more of the perspective of collectivism then?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. I think Jesus's practices were concerned with collective justice.
Okay.
Which includes individual justice.
Right.
You can make up a community of individuals, but you cannot make a whatever the inverse of that is. Can't figure it out.
Yeah.
Make a community of individuals. But you can't make an individual out of communities.
Yes.
I would say that's the only way you can make an individual.
Yeah, I don't believe that. Don't weigh in on me on that. I will give.
You're cutting out.
Uh-oh.
I missed what you said the last 5 seconds.
Oh, I said forget everything I just said. Okay.
Yeah, I think that we have social brains. I think that any sense of individualism is going to come from our social nature. I think that that's absolutely true. And I just used absolutely right before I was about to make a point, which is that it's, the problem is always in absolutizing things. It's always in saying the absolute individual is, some kind of ideal or something, where it's just not the case. So I'm very much interested in quote unquote transcendental conditions. What are the conditions of humanity? What are the actual, I'm very interested in neuropsychology and evolutionary psychology and like what actually makes up a human being and how do we actually think, actually do things, actually develop, and we have social brains. So earlier, I can't remember exactly what term you used that I was going to refer to in this way, but you mentioned something about how our consciousness or our sense of self is always it's always dying, but reconstituted and remade from I think you made the connection of it being reconstituted by the people around us. Is that what you said, or something to that effect?
Yeah.
Okay, so the idea that I've been working with before I even gained the vocabulary of pragmatism or anything philosophical at all was the neuroscientist, the theory of consciousness from a neuroscientist, Michael Graziano, and he came up with this theory of consciousness called attention schema theory of consciousness. And the whole idea is that consciousness is a schema. And he defines what he means by schema in the sense that it's something that is constructed, deconstructed, and reconstructed constantly and simultaneously. So it's very circular. You, as a kid, you don't have, and this goes back to everything you were just saying, James, as an infant, you don't have any foundation to differentiate anything. So the whole world, you can't learn anything, you can't memorize, you can't remember anything, because you have nothing differentiated. Everything is just one big block universe. And as you get older, you start you start gathering, first of all, the technology or the biological technology of language, the human technology of language. And so you can start cutting up reality. You can start cutting up things into words and concepts and different things. And as you gain vocabulary, you start gaining, you start seeing all these different things in the world. And so the idea, going back to the theory, is with the schema consciousness, is that it's something that's constantly constructing by the things in reality or in the world, and then deconstructing by things not working out in the world, because your brain computes all that. Even if you don't do it consciously, your body is one big input system of everything around it. And so you are taking in, and this goes to embodied consciousness in that field, but you're constantly taking in information from all the people, which is a whole reality in itself, and the world around you. And you're taking in, you're constructing the world behind the scenes, by the way, and then deconstructing and reconstructing. That's just how the human being is. And so I feel like an individual. I feel like I have subjectivity. My world is, we're always going to have to deal with the solipsism problem, where how can I know that there is reality outside of my own brain? That's just something that we have to deal with. For me, it's a leap of faith that I believe that this is not just a simulation in my head. I think that there's actually people around me.
We can ignore that problem entirely.
Okay, you're a positivist then.
I would say that it is sufficiently ridiculous. And as much as I love absurdism, that would be a step too far.
Right. And I wouldn't make that step either. I'm just saying that that my subjectivity, my sense of self, is created through not only the world that I live in, but the social world that I live in. And I think it's a condition of being a human individual to have all those things as factors.
And to your point, there's a good argument to be made that the brain is only it does a lot of things, but its primary function is sign relations. So when you're an infant, the first thing that you have to do is you open your eyes, and you are not just, first of all, there's a long history of epistemology prioritizing your eyeballs for empirical data gathering. I don't know why that is. If you're wearing glasses, I need glasses. Our eyes suck. But anyway, a baby is born into the world, and they are blasted with sense overload. And the process of distinguishing things far away and nearby, things that are hard, when you touch a thing, you're already making a sign relation of what does this feel like that distinguishes it and signifies it differently than this other thing that's over here, that's wet and soft or whatever.
Yeah. And
so then it's absolutely amazing how quick babies pick up language and communication. Yeah. And I really don't want to say it's like we are programmed, but there seems to be some kind of software that runs really similar on all of us.
Yeah.
And so a lot of analytical philosophers will get really mad if you say that philosophy is, or language is first philosophy. because they always wanted it to be metaphysics. But
that's
language is metaphysical in that way because it makes up it's the way that we interpret and interact with the world.
Yeah. Yeah, you just described my pragmatist position, actually.
Good.
Okay.
I guess I can be a pragmatist. My only hang-up on pragmatism is really just one of those petty philosophy arguments. Sort of like, it's similar to, well, Kant would open the door for the Nazis because you can't lie if they were asked to. There were any Jews in the attic. And then a bunch of really smug philosophers who got paid to write that criticism. There's an entire field of people that just write moral dilemmas based on your moral principles. And so one of these moral dilemmas within pragmatism is if we prioritize use function of information or an action without establishing what the ends are, or if when we prioritize the means, sometimes we can fall short in all sorts of examples that normal pragmatists probably wouldn't use. But that's one of the things about one of the hang-ups with pragmatism is that if we say that something is good when it is useful, then we don't get to make any kind of claim on essentialism or transcendentalism or anything external from the contextual use of a thing.
That's a much more nuanced way of describing exactly one of my personal problems with pragmatism that I've talked with you before about as well, Hayden.
Yeah, and those are largely the overall misconception of what pragmatism is.
Naive conception. I'm absolutely guilty of it. I read
and so was I. And it's hard.
I read half a book by James.
And like I was saying earlier, it seems like I've had a naive conception also.
I know it had something to do with happiness, the pursuit of happiness, and he was the father of pragmatism. And he was I remember him being a very good writer.
He's an extremely good writer.
But also that could be because they didn't have to translate his shit from French or German or Danish.
Well, his brother was Henry James, the literary writer, and they came from a very literary family. Every single one of them were writers. The James family is one of the.
They were one of prestige.
Yes, and they benefited literarily. But so the idea of what's true is what works is what everyone thinks about when they think of pragmatism. And that's coming from mostly James. What I was going to say earlier when you were talking about signs, Charles Peirce is one of like the two considered like founders of semiotics. And who's the other guy? What's his other name?
Strauss? No.
Yeah,
Strauss. Strauss.
Yeah, Strauss. He came up with, I think he called it semiology.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so
I covered this on one of the episodes with Tim as well. We tried to get into it. We're going to do a whole other episode on that.
You would be familiar with the name. So Peirce, he's considered by many people in many different fields to be the most original thinker of America ever. He was kind of a mad genius. I think he probably had autism. I think he was just like and I say that because people just did not understand them. He left his wife for a gypsy. He was all over the place. William James had to keep like raising funds to so that he could survive, but he was brilliant. And he came up with
he could have lived in a barrel in ancient Greece.
Yeah, exactly.
American capitalism and American exceptionalism had to make his friend bust money for him.
He was modern Diogenes, but he came up his pragmatism was very much pragmatism. Charles Peirce is considered the father of pragmatism. He's the guy that came up with the pragmatic maxim, and his maxim was very much connected to his theory of signs. And throughout his life, he was always trying to develop not only his pragmatism, which he didn't call it that, but he was also developing his theory of science. It was very, very important to him. Like he obsessed over his entire life, probably to his social detriment. But anyways,
yeah,
so like,
a lot of philosophers really fuck up their own lives. The existentialists actually got it right. And we're like, we're just gonna go ahead and live our lives because this pursuit is meaningless. And they had a lot of fun.
And that's very similar to William James's philosophy. He's very much an existentialist philosopher, and that is where he's coming from when you said like his thing about happiness. It wasn't about happiness. It was very much about like how do we actually move on with our lives. His entire will to believe idea in philosophy, if you want to call it that, was very much existential. It's very much like there's things we cannot know just because it's impossible to know, but believing in certain things actually creates the truth of the thing. And so like one of his examples is the guy that's stuck on a mountain and there's an avalanche behind him and he has to make this leap across this crevice. Now, if he believes that he can make the leap, he might have the ability to do so. If he doesn't believe, maybe he'll slip, maybe he'll fall. He won't have what it takes to make the jump. And so what William James does is, which I'm not sure, just personally, I'm not sure if anybody ever made this connection, but he was one of the first people, I think, to bring intention into the truthfulness of things or the factualness of things. Like he brought intention into like the philosophical dialogue where the intention, so usually people think of causality as bottom up or past has priority. So past events create the present, and the present will be the past that creates the future or whatever. What intention does, and what William James talks about in his will to believe, is this idea of a reversal of causation where the future is what creates the present situation. So what we think about the future determines or partly determines. So you have all this baggage of determining factors from the past, but then you have things called ideals and things called aspirations and things called telos and things called, beliefs about what things will be like tomorrow that, and aims, high aims. And this, can obviously be related to Jordan Peterson's philosophy, but we don't need to go that far. But there's something about intentions that reverses causality where you cannot do certain things unless you have an intention to do so. So there's certain things that unless you think you can do so, unless you aim higher than where you are presently, you will never do it. Or if you do it, it'll be by just random, chaos theory chance. Yeah. And so it brings in this entire factor, of intention, of aim, of ideal that has, for me, so that's really important with William James's pragmatism. And that has become very important for me with regard to my understanding of religion and my separating or nuancing the whole science versus religion debate. I think that those are two different areas of human life that are discussing very different things, using the word true in very different ways. Like true is the word true is functioning in very different ways.
Yeah,
I know.
We only have so many words.
Yeah.
It seems like we would have all the words because we also have an infinite amount of words, and yet somehow we're still stuck with the same dumb fucking words to describe entirely different problems. Mm-hmm. William James is also really influential with new thought leaders and some of the New Age kind of hippie movements in the 60s.
That's coming from.
I almost picked up a book in a bookstore, but I saw that it was about William James and New Age, and I put it back. I didn't want to read it.
Yeah, I definitely don't have any affinity with New Age. I did in my postmodernist days as a Christian, but I kind of threw that all up after I gained better vocabularies. But yeah, I would definitely. My guess is that kind of connection is from either one of two places, either a misunderstanding of his will to believe doctrine, which is very easy to misunderstand. So anyone that wants to critique
the author is dead. Interpretive works.
There you go. Because you can definitely interpret it, very differently. Plus, it didn't help that Mussolini, isn't that the Italian
Yeah.
authoritarian?
Yeah.
He was influenced by James's pragmatism, and so Bertrand Russell is coming from the perspective of that context, and so his
Who
critique
was also one of the meanest academics ever.
Yeah, he was an asshole, but his critique of pragmatism has 100% set the critique of pragmatism since then.
Oh,
That makes sense.
Okay.
So everyone has been saying the exact same.
I've been saying the same dumb shit that
because I am.
That reminds me of how Hitler appropriated Nietzsche's work because Nietzsche's sister was a big fan of Hitler, so they
could have appropriated Heidegger.
Yeah, exactly.
He was on their team.
Yeah.
Would have been a very easy switch.
Hitler used Nietzsche's final text, even it even influenced some of his speeches, if I remember correctly.
Well, and Nietzsche was a very provocative reader.
Yeah.
When I was in college and we had to read him, I remember I would come and we'd get our essay or whatever, and I would take it home and I would read it, and I would come back into class and everyone would be talking about how great it is, and I would go, "What the fuck is this shit?" I'm so mad this guy gets away with this shit. He's just angry. I could have written that. He's just angry and dying. And now that I've revisited it a couple places, I mean, he's still just I'll say provocative. Strong language, strong imagery, which is actually, I think, more helpful now that I'm outside of a more analytic approach to philosophy. So I don't have to look at the logic tables of an argument. I can just kind of get the feel of it now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I remember when reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra, for example, by Nietzsche. At first, after I first read it, my reaction was similar. I was like, what the fuck is he talking about, man? So I had to look up interpretations of his meaning and then realize, oh, this is actually really interesting. I think that's actually a great idea.
One of the benefits of reading Nietzsche in college under a professor, as opposed to reading Nietzsche in high school, where a bunch of people did, and then they become angsty dickheads, is that when you read Nietzsche in college, you have a professor saying, when he says this really provocative thing, he's not talking about mankind as in it the essentialism of mankind. He's talking about these specific men in his specific context.
Yeah.
He was very well read. He knew his history, and that's why he was able to make the genealogy of morality. And I always, now when I approach Nietzsche, I can see how his footsteps kind of laid a lot of ground for more postmodern works. But I think my big problem with Nietzsche is I never know how to summarize him, because I'm like, you just have to read the guy. He's insane.
Yeah.
You can't summarize a passage that talks about there once was man that invented knowing, and then when they died, all of that died with them. And you'd be like, okay, so the implications of his tale that he sets up are that people create knowledge, and that this knowledge is also dictated by the people that create it. Prominent societies probably produce maybe not better knowledge, but are better at producing knowledge because they're bigger and more powerful, which is why we don't know a whole lot about indigenous societies. Anyway, that's my rant on Nietzsche.
Yeah.
I didn't like him. Now I kind of like him, but maybe I'm just getting old.
Yeah.
Cranky.
I need to read a lot more Nietzsche. I've only read a little bit of his stuff.
You don't. You just need to read a little bit of him. Once you get the feel of certain philosophers, you can almost stop, because it's not that they don't have more interesting things to say. It's just that you're going to just nod along with everything else they say if you bought into what they have already.
Oh, that's a really interesting point, actually. Yeah.
There's a really long tradition in philosophy that I hate, and of a philosopher has to write about everything. Aristotle wrote about physics, metaphysics, logic, ethics, everything. He wrote about animals and biology. So did Descartes. They were wrong, super wrong. But that wasn't the point. The point was that if you wanted to be a philosopher, you had to have a philosophy of everything.
Right.
And
because they're working from a foundationalist, like once you get the basic principles, now you can apply that to everything. So that was kind of part of the package, is applying it to everything.
Yeah. Here's my metaphysical principle. Here's the different ways that it acts out in the world. Here's some examples that I can make up that make it sound like it's true. And if you accept my premise, then the conclusion must be true, because I also invented how logic works. But now philosophers don't have the time to do that. So a lot of what I think is a detriment to philosophy is that we don't let philosophers sit down and do philosophy anymore, because they have to teach 5 classes. And teaching is part of what you have to do. But it's very different from sitting down and developing an opus. It just wouldn't make sense for you to do that. And you'd be wrong as shit anyway. Why would you show your ass like that? But I think this translates well into when we want to talk about what postmodernism is, we're still looking for that. What are the founding principles, so that I can extract all the logical implications? Here are all the dangerous implications of postmodernism. Well, a lot of the postmodernists told you that these were dangerous implications. That's what they were fucking telling you. Yeah. Jameson wrote in the 90s, he was saying, this is shit. And we have to do something about this. Derrida wrote, and almost every text that I've read from him has some humility in it, where he goes, I can't stand up for this, but this is just the way that that this is turning out. If I'm wrong in how I think about this, please correct me. But when his process of deconstruction was always look at all of these absurdities that you've clumped together into this picture, and if we take some of those absurdities out, what does your picture look like now? And are those, a greater question is, are those absurdities also a necessity for that picture? Do you have to have some weird contradiction shit? There was somebody, I can't remember who it was, but he was talking about Aristotle. Aristotle wrote the principle of non-contradiction, which states it's a logic. If you ever take a logic course, good luck.
The law of the excluded middle.
I remember
that kind of shit. So
I remember you telling me about how in your logic class, everyone failed when you had to take a test.
Yeah, I got the second highest grade, and that was a 32. And then we moved on to the next section.
Yeah,
there was no you didn't revisit the material. You got the wrong answer.
Yeah,
that's illogical. Sit on it. Figure it out.
I was terrible at logic.
I am better at math now since taking that logic course. And I remember being really good in the first 2 weeks, because I was like, perfect, I can follow logical arguments. And then he's like, okay, now draw it.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh,
diagram that shit.
Yeah, I can't do that. That part I mess up on.
Yeah.
But so Aristotle wrote the principle of non-contradiction, which is a thing A cannot be both A and B. So it can't be something or it can't be A and not A. That's a better way.
Right.
It can't be a thing and also not the thing. And so when we examine a lot of the world, especially in social conditions, or we try and parse them out in scientific discoveries, but we find contradictions all over the place. Yeah. And I can't remember who the thinker was, but he was talking about how contradictions help in a relational sense to kind of reaffirm the other. So they work with one another in order to accentuate their differences, so you can see both of them more clearly. Anyway.
Yeah, that's a big part of the Christian. I don't want to say postmodernist because after everything that we've already said, but the very big deconstructionist Christian culture that is, you know, growing and growing right now, which I became.
Do you listen to the deconstructionists?
No, I don't, but I know who they are.
Yeah, they have a very. I hope they don't listen to this show. They have a very youth pastor voice. I had to turn it off. They had really good guests though, but they had really good guests.
And that's why I couldn't listen to them, because I mean, and I'm pretty sure they had the same name. I think both of them had the same name or something. Or I'm thinking about another one, but it's this. I couldn't, because it's always the same in this
Adam
culture. Yeah. Yeah, well, one of these shows is like David and David, and I was just like, I can't handle this. But that's one of the things in this kind of deconstructionist Christian culture. And you know, whatever you think deconstructionist means, this culture is a very specific culture. And what you were saying about the youth pastor voice,
I know who you're talking about. These people have appropriated deconstruction as a thing in order to understand their theology, which is important, and then feel better about it, which is important.
Yeah, coming from that world, I'm not as charitable about the underlying intentions. I'm not. Like, I think it's all. I feel like most of it is all signaling. I think it's all signaling. I think it's all virtue signaling to, you know, to show, we're the edgy ones, you know, because you have their audience are all people.
Christians.
Because their audience is not people existentially struggling with these things. Their audience is people who still go to church and still buy into the whole system. They just think that, we need to rethink some things. So it's appropriating and in a lot of ways misappropriating, you know, especially the origins of where their, you know, so-called methods are coming from. Like, anybody can be a deconstructionist. Anybody can pick apart things. It doesn't take a lot to do that.
Deconstruction. I was talking with Dr. Sadler. Everybody does philosophy. The only thing that I do differently is that I maybe recognize when I'm doing it and take it too far. So instead of doing like a little bit of philosophy, I end up doing a whole lot more philosophy. And sometimes that gets in the way of decision making or having an attitude about a certain problem. That can be a pain in the ass. My wife does fantastic philosophy. She hates it. I got her. We were arguing about whether a hot dog is a sandwich. Counts as a sandwich.
What do you think?
It's not.
Of course it is. But also, it gets worse. So she was. There's also a fun, it's, I guess, a meme, a philosophy meme, that everything is either a soup or a sandwich. Those are the only two kinds. It's
so a salad is a soup or a sandwich?
A salad is an open-faced sandwich.
Really?
Or a dry soup. You can categorize it as either. And so there's soup sandwich dualism, and then there is me. I'm a soup monist, so I think everything is soup. And my wife was very angry at the very idea of this absurd statement. And she goes, "You're a soup." And I go, "That's right. I'm a soup. I'm made up of soup. You cut me open. It looks like soup. It's very soupy in here. I'm just held in this nice bread bowl with bones."
Yeah, I would never get that far with my fiance.
It's one of those fun things. Every once in a while, philosophy is fun and absurd and ridiculous, and that's what I think is important about at least recognizing this the utility of what philosophers do, and the idea that you can make anything sound logical if it's argued well enough. This goes all the way back to the sophists and Zeno's paradoxes. Who was that? There was another one. I can't remember his name. He was another Presocratic philosopher, and he wrote that you don't exist. And he started with a list of claims, and they all followed in a logical order, and somehow you end up getting tricked by the end of the piece, his little speech that he did. And he goes, "And therefore you don't exist." And you go, "Fuck, I don't exist." And you have to really pay attention and go backwards and find where you mistook. But there's an analytical philosopher that says you don't have hands.
That's pretty cool.
Is that a reference to Wittgenstein?
I don't know. I just see the argument.
That was his whole thing. That was his whole thing.
Was that him specifically? Yeah.
Well, no, he would say he was writing about certainty in his book on certainty.
Right, yeah.
And he was talking about, like we are certain about all sorts of things. Like we're certain about things, which means that there's things that we just take as a given and we never question it. And so like to say, as a skeptic, like doubt everything, you literally can't. That was his whole thing, is that you cannot doubt that you have a hand, because you can say it, but it's all just rhetoric.
That's posturing.
Yeah. My cat's destroying my recording fort.
My cats are really close to getting.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if you guys can hear them. They're running around.
I see one behind you.
Oh shit. Yeah, they've been running around a bunch.
With what you said about how you can philosophize anything, that's why I like just looking at philosophy for entertainment sometimes, like the philosophy of literature, or like I like the YouTube channel Wisecrack, because they go into the philosophy of movies and TV shows and stuff like that. Yeah.
And all of our actions have some kind of we can find some kind of philosophical principle, even if you believe that you're operating at random. That randomness can also, we can suss that out and look at what is the logic of randomness. There's a mathematical paper talking about. I saved it because I didn't understand it, and I thought maybe if I revisited it later I would. But it's the mathematical proof for randomness.
Oh wow!
Like the formula for it, the formula for randomness.
Yeah, Tickism.
It was like 8 students, and they maybe figured it out. I don't know. I tried reading it, and I got lost. And I asked my professor. I went, "Did you get this?" And he goes, "I'm going to read it again."
Wow. So, that's interesting. I mean,
boy or girl?
Like girl, and she almost knocked down my entire everything. Yeah, I have a little fort to kind of like control the sound, and she just jumped on top of it.
Mine tore all of the sound foam that I put on my wall. I took all of it off. They were like, "Is this a scratching wall now? Awesome." And just rip that shit off.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I actually have to get going.
I need to eat dinner too. So
yeah, me as well.
I could do this for a couple hours.
Right. That's the feeling I had, is that we could literally do this all night long.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah, no problem, man.
I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about, and there's so much that, like, I wanted to say, but there's just not enough time to say. I mean, I think that we could draw connections between our two different ways of thinking, like all night long. And that's something that I'm specifically interested in, because I think that there are, especially with your understanding of postmodernity, and not this, misconception of what postmodernism is. I think that there are a lot of connections to draw, specifically just, the
I
fact
think it's
that
mostly just filling in gaps of information. I don't know everything you know, and you don't know everything I know.
And you guys are both educating me a hell of a lot too.
You read way more than I do, Andrew.
That's true. So I am catching up fast.
You're gonna get on the other end. I am definitely the tortoise, but I don't ever get up from like that nap. I like to keep it a slow crawl.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it takes me a very long time to read anything. It could be a 5-page, article or philosophical paper, and I gotta make every single kind of connection, because that's just kind of how I think we learn in general. I'm like, okay, how can I connect this to something that I already know? And then
you draw all over your books.
Right. Yeah, pretty much. I can never resell them or return them.
I tried to read a Bauman book, but it was just the PDF, and I couldn't print out 250 pages. And I was like, I can't write on this. I'm not going to read it.
Yeah,
if I can't make notes, I'm not retaining any of this shit. So
yeah, I wish if you could see how many thousands and thousands of papers I printed out that I still have in my house right now.
I saved everything from college, everything philosophy related, and all my interesting classes. So some of my literature classes as well. I saved all of that. I was looking through it and I was like, this is garbage. I said, look at this essay. This is the most pompous philosophical position.
I like to use sticky notes when I'm reading, and go back over the sticky notes after I'm done reading the book. So then I get
to carve into the book.
Yeah.
I like to get a knife and just jab it in there.
All right. I'm gonna go and get some dinner.
Yeah, man.
Thanks, guys. This is fun. For all of you watching and listening, if you're interested in hearing me talk more, cool. You can find me at James and the Giant Podcast. It's on everything, I think. I haven't had anybody tell me it wasn't available. And I remember putting it on Stitcher and Google Play. You can find me on Twitter and Facebook at James Giant Pod. I respond to almost any questions unless they have to do with libertarianism.
Yeah, and for me, everything he just said, just pragmaticchristian.com is the website, or Pragmatic Christian podcast. It really is just a brand. I had to stick with it. I'm not happy with it, but and Andrew calls me after
yourself.
I know I should have, but I'm a nobody. So, but yeah, you can find me in all the places. And if you can't find me in a place, let me know at Hayden the Bruce on Twitter, because I want to know where I'm not reaching.
Where are you missing out? Yeah,
I know. Apparently.
Yeah. All right.
But hey, I had a really good time meeting you, James.
Hey, you too, man.
I want to do a podcast with you on our separate shows, or at least on mine.
Do it, man.
Absolutely.
Very soon.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Sure. I'm trying to organize a couple interviews, but I haven't gotten any. I don't have a schedule, so whatever.
Yeah. No, me either. So if you want to set that up with, with me after this, I'd really enjoy that. I've been wanting to have you on for a while.
I'll send you a message tonight.
Looking forward to that. Yeah.
All right. See you guys.
I'll talk again too.
All
right. So So thanks everyone so much for watching another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. This was a really fun conversation, and I really appreciate both of you guys talking to me. And thanks everyone so much to everyone who's subscribed to my channel, and to everyone who's contributed to me on Patreon. I really appreciate the fuck out of that. It means a lot to me, especially if anyone else subscribes to my channel or wants to contribute to me on Patreon. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And always remember this: the funk cures all.
Right
All
on.
right. All right.
Right on.
Adios, everyone, and keep
Later,
having
guys.
mindgasms until next time. All
All
right.
right. See you guys.
Bye.